Record. There we go. So, hello there. Welcome to Carol McGrath, who is the writer and novelist of, amongst other things, The Silken Rose, which tells the story of Eleanor of Provence. So, Carol, hello. How are you in sunny Oxfordshire?
Hi, Ruadh. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about your writing. It's an indulgence, actually.
I should probably do a warning that we are both from Northern Ireland. So if we go too Northern Irish, just, we'll try and limit it, and we'll try and go back to, because I know if when I speak to more other Northern Irish people on this, I tend to get even more Northern Irish than is possible. So I will attempt to talk as slowly as possible for this one. But I suppose we should dive right into it. Obviously, congratulations. I've had the pleasure of reading The Silken Rose. And I thought it was an incredible book, so detailed, and and obviously the research is a big part of it. But it was such a lovely part of the era to read about, and somewhere I didn't really know about, and someone who I didn't really know that much about. So, how did you discover Eleanor of Provence?
Well, I was always encouraged to. I was going to write more Tudor books. I had written one Tudor book about Thomas Cromwell's wife. And I was going to actually work on a couple of more Tudor books, but I was very encouraged to stay with the medieval period, because I had written those books about just after the 1066 conquest, which were very successful. And so I thought, well, who will I write about? I don't really want to write more post-conquest books. And I've been reading a book called The Sister Queens about Eleanor of Provence and her sisters, because she had three all very beautiful sisters and no brothers, and I thought that's very interesting. And when I read The Sister Queens by Sophie Perronel, who is American actually, not French, and whom I had the pleasure of meeting last year at a conference in America, and we've become very firm friends since, but she was the inspiration for this book. The book focused really on Eleanor's sister, the older sister. I mean, it did talk about all of the sisters, but it focused mostly on Marguerite, who was married to the King of France at the age of about 13. And that was Louis, who became Saint Louis.
Okay.
And of course, his mother was the dominant character in her life, because Blanche, the mother, who originally ruled as regent for Louis, because he became king whenever he was a child. And she was a very, very strong personality, and really almost, destroyed the marriage, in fact.
Oh, right.
But Marguerite persisted, and Marguerite had a very good marriage with Louis in the end, and they did have children. And they did go on crusade. She went on crusade with him and so on. So I thought Eleanor's really interesting too, because in The Sister Queens, you get the impression all the daughters were going to marry well, partially because Provence was very strategically important, not because her father had any money. He didn't even have money for dowries. But they did have beauty. They were cultured. They were highly educated, and had a very strong sense of nobility.
Okay.
And they didn't take hostages where peasantry were concerned, although you do get the impression that Provence was a fairly peaceable, very nice place to live, even in the Middle Ages on the whole.
And why was it such an important place? Is it simply geography?
Geography.
Yeah.
Absolutely geography, because it guarded, it had access to the Mediterranean, and it also guarded an awful lot of the passes through into Switzerland, and thus down through Italy and to other parts of Europe.
That's Savoy kind of, you think of
right.
her as Eleanor of Provence, but she was Savoy.
She was Savoy as well through her mother, because her mother was Beatrice of Savoy, married to Raymond Béranger, who was the ruler of Provence, Count Raymond. They were counts, not kings and queens. And they were always trying to protect their territory from too much influence from France, because although they did have connections with France, and eventually incredible connections with France, and of course England was always trying to look around for ways in which to protect trade routes for themselves, perhaps going east, and to make very good marriages within Europe. And also they'd had the experience during King John's reign of the French actually coming and invading England invited, of course, at that point. And King John, I have to say, was Henry III's father. So, you know, you've got a situation where Normandy was lost, and it was always very important to protect what they got left, which was actually Gascony, which takes in Aquitaine. And also, you know, they wanted to make whatever good alliances they could make. Well, originally Henry was engaged to Joan of Flanders, a move that Blanche, whom I mentioned, who was really essentially ruling France at the time, because her son was really quite young, Blanche was trying to completely disturb that alliance, because that alliance was too close to French interests. And so Henry did, you know, by this point he was 28 years old, and he was sort of like casting around for a bride. And the story goes that, well, of course, Beatrice of Savoy was very well connected, because Beatrice of Savoy had a lot of brothers, and they were all highly educated, highly intelligent, and very social as well. And that appealed to Henry whenever he eventually met them. They only had beautiful daughters, those two. And they, the story goes that Richard of Cornwall, who was Henry's brother, stopped by in Provence in their castle of Les Baux on his way back from the Crusades. And he was internationally known. He was a really dynamic character, although he was the younger son of John. He was Henry's younger brother, the only brother he had. Eleanor was the senior princess, because Marguerite had married to King Louis of France, and Eleanor was only 12 years old at the time. So she also loved poetry, and she loved the stories of King Arthur. So she writes a poem for Richard. She actually quite fancies Richard. She writes, oh God, I've lost it.
Oh, I can still hear you. Hold on 1 second. I can fix it, so it should be okay.
I've lost it.
No, it should be okay.
Am I back?
You're back.
Am I back? Okay.
We were talking about.
I pressed, the way I was holding it, I pressed the thing.
Well,
anyway, so
we're talking.
She wrote a poem for Richard, who showed the poem to his brother Henry, and Henry decided, this is the girl for me.
Okay.
Never mind it being strategically important, and never mind having trouble over Joan of Flanders. So he sends for Eleanor, and he's quite willing to take Eleanor without a dowry. He's so keen. Okay. So no dowry was necessary. Henry wanted her. Henry was going to get her. He'd been single far too long. At this point, he was sort of like 31 or 32. And who could not resist such a story that she had written? And who could not resist such a story to write? Yeah. And so that's how I came to write the story of Eleanor of Provence, because when I discovered all the background, the romantic background, troubadour background, and the shenanigans and everything, I just thought, this is definitely almost like a fairy story, but it's real.
And that's also sound what really appealed to Henry as well. That's the perhaps the strangest part, that he was more interested in the romantic side of things, and maybe it speaks to him as a character as well. And I think you've quite painted him in very romantic light as well. That he isn't the factional, infighting, political monster that possibly his father and grandfather were, but is
no, he wasn't.
Yeah, rather lovely character actually.
Henry is a very misrepresented king. Henry was, and a lot of historians now are revisiting him and reviving him in a more positive light, because I mean, of course, he is subject to circumstances, and he is subject to his past. And one of the ways in which he was subject to his past, which comes into your next question, is that Henry's nobles had, you know, the whole Normandy had been lost, and all the property they had in Normandy had been lost, and they would become very anti-French, because the French had been thrown out of England, because the French had got into England during his father's reign. So we're now 20-30 years on, and by this point, a lot of these nobles, the next generation, Henry's generation, are actually really quite xenophobic about France. And they are becoming more and more English, and you're even getting English spoken at court as well as French. Oh. So it wasn't as late as Chaucer's time that was happening. It wasn't in the 1300s. It was already happening in the mid-1200s. that English would be spoken at court as well as French. I mean, French was still the main language, but they did speak English, and they were very anti having too much foreign influence in government. Now, the barons, ever since the Magna Carta, had and with a young king, like a boy king, Henry was only 9 years old whenever he became king, and also his mother fled the country. Well, she didn't flee the country. She actually went with her daughter. His mother went with the elder daughter, another Joan, to settle her into Lusignan, where she was going to marry her the mother's previous engaged man, Duke of Lusignan, before John swept her off her feet or decided he was having her. So, you know, you got all of those intricacies, but he should arrange her daughter to marry this man's son. But in the end, it was Isabella, who married this man's son. So she married the younger Hugh of Lusignan, having snatched him from her daughter, who was only about 9 or 10 at the time. And so Henry was left motherless, which always made Henry want a family, I think. Psychologically, he was very loyal to his brothers and sisters. So he depended on them. But it did mean, too, that the barons got a lot of power during that time. There was no queen mother. She was off, and they disapproved of that marriage incredibly.
Yeah.
And they had an awful lot of power over the money, over the exchequer. And they wanted to keep that power. And they certainly did not want Savoyard uncles coming into the country, interfering, marrying their potential heiresses who they might marry, or, you know, just getting control of Henry, which is what happened. This girl, she came at the age of 13, and she came with her uncles. Well, she came, first of all, with one particular uncle, and that uncle, actually, Henry just absolutely adored him. He was so intelligent and so, you know, persuasive and you know, clear intellect, and so he stayed.
Right. And
I
suppose
so then she brought in Uncle Peter after that, and Uncle Peter was equally intelligent and equally interesting, and so Henry got him to stay as well. So Uncle Peter stayed, and he's the person who actually built the Savoy Palace. And the other thing is that along with these uncles, and then eventually Uncle Thomas shows up, and, you know, a few more uncles do show up, and so basically Henry is really, you know, it's another family for him.
Yeah.
And he's very happy with that. So, but of course the barons aren't. Now, Henry did like also the Savoyard and Provençal administrators who came along with them, because one of the things about Raymond Berenger, Eleanor's father, was that Raymond had a really strong civil service. He kept control of them, like nobody ever gainsaid Raymond. He never would let his barons get control of him in any way, in the same way as the English barons got control of Henry. So you can see where, you know, I suppose she got, Eleanor of Provence got political acumen from her father, at least as far as survival is concerned.
Yeah.
And so she wasn't very happy about the control that the barons in England were trying to get over Henry's rule, as, you know, rights that were actually laid down with Magna Carta. And this is what really led to the Barons' War during the Second Barons' War of that century, which was during Henry's reign, because eventually the barons got fed up and they got their leader in Simon de Montfort, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he didn't want to lose control of his exchequer, Henry, and so therefore he got these Provençal, and that was a main point of conflict, because of course the English barons, you know, always one of them was in charge of the exchequer. Now the Savoyards were sophisticated and attractive, and the English barons, of course, have become very insular. And of course they were also like petty mafia, really, you know, these guys. I mean, let's face it, the Middle Ages, as you've written about the Middle Ages, and we can talk about the romanticism, but there is like the opposite as well. There's the absolute cruelty and barbarity around in the Middle Ages too, and they all fought amongst themselves for power. It was all about land and all about land grab and all about power and money. So the barons were also infuriated by any intermarriage that these Savoyards would get involved in. And later on, of course, the third Provençal daughter, let's say, the younger sister, married Richard of Cornwall, because Richard of Cornwall had been married at the same time as Eleanor of Provence came to England.
Yeah.
But his wife died, and she was a daughter of the very famous Marshall.
Oh, yes.
William Marshall. She was one of the Marshall clan. And so when she died, and she was a lot older than Richard, supposed to be very beautiful, but when she died, she was the eldest Marshall daughter. And when she died, of course, he was free, and they arranged a marriage between him and Sancha, who was Sancha of Provence, who was so that was another thing. But it wasn't just that Sancha came to England; it was that she brought a lot of people too. And that her mother came over for various days, and Henry actually was very generous to the mother and gave the mother pensions and money and jewels and all sorts of things, because he just was that way inclined, and the barons didn't like that either.
You can sort of see the beginnings of this antagonism between the two factions, really, and I suppose between the other factions below it, but this kind of uniting of the barons once again against these interlopers who are, I mean, I can imagine the barons sort of thinking of these, pensions as, that should have been mine. My grandfather was in that position. I should be doing that. You can see the antagonism beginning. I mean, could you talk a little bit about maybe about Simon de Montfort and his rise? Obviously, a very auspicious marriage.
Right, Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort, he actually was an impoverished French knight. He was French, and at first they were all very against Simon de Montfort. Didn't like him either, because he got into favour with Henry because he was another charmer, although he was also an absolute brute as well. And but he could be very charming, and he wanted to get back some territory that had belonged to him, and during John's reign had been given elsewhere. And so he eventually persuades Henry to give him right to those lands, which included the Castle of Kenilworth. And so he developed the Castle of Kenilworth with money from Henry, and that he made that his seat. So his main seat was Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire. Henry had a sister, Eleanor, who was married to William Marshall. Now that William Marshall is the Marshall's son. So he's the eldest Marshall, the eldest son. So his sister was married to the eldest son at the age of 9 and brought up with his family. And then at the age of 15, Marshall dies. All the Marshall sons died, actually, as a matter of interest. But he died, and she'd actually fallen in love with her husband, I believe, but she did take an oath of chastity. And the oath of chastity was that she would never marry again. She was married to Christ, but she wasn't a nun. She was a nun, but not a nun. But she didn't wear colourful clothes or jewels or anything like that, but she still stayed at court. But this oath of chastity was fairly binding. However, she comes across Simon de Montfort at court. This is quite important, because this is what really binds de Montfort with Henry III. By this time, Henry is married to Eleanor, and Eleanor and the two Eleanors do become quite friendly, but she presumably is quite pro Simon de Montfort at this point as well, is Eleanor of Provence. And so Henry, wanting to favour Simon de Montfort, knows that the barons will not accept a marriage to his sister, knowing too that his sister has taken an oath of chastity and is not to be married to anybody. But he does arrange a secret marriage between his sister and Simon de Montfort,
Oh,
just
romantic.
after Christmas, in about 3 years after Eleanor had come to England. Eleanor of Provence had come to England. And so Simon de Montfort's very in with the family. And of course, he gets grants and lands and so on and so forth. And he's very pro the Provençals as well. And everything's fine with Simon de Montfort and Henry. Simon de Montfort, I have to add, his father was a real warrior. His father was also responsible for the massacre of the Cathars in France.
Yeah.
He was the older Simon de Montfort was responsible for that. So Simon de Montfort came from that background, and he was pretty anti-Jewish, and he was pretty anti-sects like the Cathars as well. That's the bad side of Simon de Montfort. But those were different times. I mean, we can judge them according to what we believe now, but it doesn't really work because the whole atmosphere and the whole power struggles of those times were different.
Yeah.
And they were the same and different. I mean, we still have got power struggles, but they had different issues. And so Simon de Montfort, everything goes quite well until the person who really was against this marriage, of course, was Richard. And Richard, when they find out about the marriage, there is a crisis, because Richard does get some of the barons on his side, a lot of them, particularly the Marshalls. All the Marshall brothers are on his side, and they threaten the king, and they get as far as Kingston, and Henry goes scurrying to the Tower. This is fact, with his wife Eleanor, and he holds up there and has meetings with his direct council and so on and so forth. And the way I play it in the book is that I have Eleanor quite involved in that council, and Eleanor makes the suggestion, well, why don't you get them all distracted by sending them all on a crusade? Because everybody was keen on crusades, because all your sins were forgiven, and all your fighting sins and all your executions of people and brutality was forgiven if you said you would go on crusade the moment you signed up. So they were interested, and there was a lot of crusading talk around at the time. And of course, Louis had already gone on crusade with Marguerite, and Henry didn't want to be, always competed with Louis. He was always in competition with Louis, so he wanted to go on crusade as well. He thought this is a very good idea. So they broached the idea of the crusade and also paid them all off, and suggested a settlement over Simon de Montfort, that Simon would go to the Pope and that he would get, the vow annulled and permission for his marriage through getting that vow annulled. Although, of course, they were already married. Okay, so Simon does that, but he has to pay the Pope off, and to do so and to cover because he actually didn't have that much money, and neither did Eleanor, his wife, because Eleanor had not been given her dower by the Marshalls. They refused to release the money that she was owed after her husband's death and the lands, and that was extensive.
Oh my goodness.
And so poor old Simon de Montfort has to borrow some money to do this. So who does he borrow it from but the Flanders, the Thomas who did marry Joan of Flanders. And Thomas is one of the Savoyard brothers. Thomas is actually Eleanor's uncle. But Thomas decided he wanted surety for this. And so who did Simon de Montfort put up as surety but the king, Henry III, without telling Henry III. So of course we have Eleanor gets pregnant, and of course we have the birth of Edward I in 39, I think it was 1239, and Simon is just, they offer that he will be a godfather, as well as Richard, his brother Richard, Edward III's brother, Henry III's brother Richard. So, everything, there's this tradition that after a birth of a child, there will be a delay of before the mother comes out into public. There's about 6 weeks to give her time to rest and so on and so forth. And then she's churched. She can't be in public until she goes through a church ceremony. And usually that's a very feminine ceremony. And that really is a big thing all throughout the Middle Ages and right into Tudor times. It's a very, very big thing. And so Eleanor's churched, and she looks around at the time of her churching, looking for Eleanor and looking for Simon, because remember, that's the first time she's allowed out in the world, and there's no evidence of them. But there is Joan of Flanders there with her husband Thomas, and Thomas has whispered in the king's ear, you know, he borrowed all this money from me and I want it back. He hasn't got it, but you have it because he's put you up as surety. Henry was shocked, and Henry listened to his barons who were anti Simon de Montfort,
Yeah.
and as a result, Simon de Montfort was lucky to get out of England with his life.
Wow.
Nobody knows who really helped Simon de Montfort leave England, but somebody told him he was, you know, in for the chop, and somebody, or at least to be put in the Tower of London, and somebody spread, you know, let him know. And I use Eleanor in that again, but it is very possible it was Henry's brother Richard. So it's one of those two, but it's not fact. We don't know exactly who it was. So anyway, Simon de Montfort does go to the continent, and he never ever comes back. He's one of the knights who'd promised to go on crusade, of course. And a few years later, that opportunity, that the crusade's going to happen, and Simon de Montfort comes back into England, and all is forgiven because everybody's very excited about going. I'm simplifying this drastically, but everybody's very excited about going on the crusade, and that's the gist of it. So he goes on the crusade with Henry's blessing. Henry doesn't go on the crusade, although he would have liked to, because Henry has to stay at home to keep peace in the country, basically, to simplify that one. But Richard goes on the crusade, and Simon goes on the crusade. Now, Richard, the next point at which Simon de Montfort comes up importantly is about, I don't know, some years later, I would say 5, 6, 7 years later, the crusade's finished.
1250s, are we now?
What?
1250s would we now be sort of talking? That's
we're in the
1240s maybe.
We're in the 1240s.
Yeah.
That crusade was not successful. And so it really wasn't. But one thing that Simon de Montfort did was he managed to get, he and Richard worked together to do this, they managed to get a lot of prisoners freed that had been taken by the Egyptians. I mean, the whole thing of that crusade is quite complex because it was focused on Egypt a lot and focused on North Africa. They didn't exactly get to Jerusalem because they thought they'll take out resistance, they'll take out Egypt and then they'll be able to move up the coast towards Jerusalem, and they weren't terribly successful in doing that for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
But they come back and well, they say they were successful up to a point because they did achieve some things, but they didn't achieve an awful lot. And they come back from that crusade, and the next thing is that Gascony raises its ugly head. So I know Henry goes to fight in Gascony, and the reason Gascony raises his ugly head is that he's really trying to save Poitou for his mother, who's married to the Licinians.
Who nobody likes.
Who nobody likes. However, it is Simon who really does save Henry's bacon and Gascony, and Richard, both of them very, very strong. But Simon is beginning to really see Richard as a crap leader.
Oh no.
Not Richard, sorry. See Henry as a very, very weak leader. And he says one or two awful things to Henry, and of course the quarrel starts up again between him and Henry because he's undermining Henry. And he's just very arrogant, and he's just not going to take any nonsense from Henry.
Yeah.
So he's in trouble with Henry, and he is banished again for a while. But Henry eventually does have to call Simon back. But at that point, and I think it's the point in Gascony where Simon really does change his loyalties, and he's not really loyal to Henry anymore. He's very, very, and of course Eleanor is very loyal to Henry.
Yeah.
And Eleanor is not going to, she's not going to maintain the friendship really with, although she does, I believe, try to smooth over the quarrel.
It's a very interesting time because you're seeing Eleanor, who was the great benefactor for Simon, now is, find themselves in different sides of the argument. Henry, who is such a romantic and such a person who is obviously looking for family in all this, I think, which is one of those little things that you just build into the story very well. You've got the Marshalls, the Richard, the brother, the very ambitious brother, the actual quite talented brother, I suspect. And you've got Eleanor herself. And I'm going to use a word of a segue word. I'm going to say many threads of this story, and all building to a greater sort of piece.
Impact.
Yeah, and obviously in the back of all this political and family drama, there's another aspect to the story of the Silken Rose, which is your obvious love of embroidery and fabrics and this that hence the segue threads that it's built into the story. Was that something that you purposely did with Rosalind and her little?
Yes, I did. I did that because those are very complicated politics. There's a couple of reasons why I've done this. I think those politics are complicated, and I wanted to simplify them as much as I possibly could so that people didn't say, oh, I can't read this book because I don't know the history behind it. I wanted to make sure it kept its strong story element the whole way through. That's the one of the reasons why I used Rosalind for this period. And the other reason was because it is it's sometimes called the magnificent 13th century, because it was the period of great Gothic building. Henry himself was very into architecture and is responsible for the Westminster Abbey we see today. And Henry was also, yes, he spent a lot of money on that, and that got him into a lot of trouble with the barristers.
You can't catch a break.
but he brought in architects from, and he also was competing with Louis. He was competing with Saint Louis, because Louis had been building beautiful cathedrals in France. And also they competed over whatever relics they had, because Louis got the crown of thorns. Henry only got one thorn from that crown, but Henry got a vial of Christ's blood. And I mean, every time they got these things, they had great processions and you know, great celebrations and great church celebrations and so on and so forth. And but yes, the embroidery, so you've got that side, the architecture, and you've got the Gothic architecture coming in. And but you've also got beautiful embroidery, and a lot of it's church embroidery, and a lot of that embroidery is done with gold and silver threads and jewels. And they use a couch stitch to push the from underneath to push the material up. And then they also, you know, they also use gold threads and everything. Whenever, say for example, embroiderer had, or a set of embroiderers had made a bishop's cope. Every time the churchman, the bishop, would move, the light of the candles in the cathedral would catch the shininess and the glow of the jewels and the threads on the cope, and it would look like he was actually.
We're still here. We're just showing the.
Okay, just
bits
showing.
and pieces. Yeah, that didn't quite work as well. We're still here.
Thank you. And there's the Silken Rose. Wonderful.
Yes, yeah, there we are. I was attempting to do something quite clever, and obviously it's. But you can keep talking about the. Yeah, there's Henry.
Okay, so I'll keep talking about that.
Yeah.
The embroidery. So I actually love the period of this period of embroidery. It's so beautiful, and they did make some secular items as well, like they would do hems of gowns and of course purses and bookmarks, you know, for these beautiful books that they had. They even do book covers, all with this gold, silver, and jeweled embroidery. And it was known throughout Europe as opus Anglicanum. It was exquisite, and it was extremely valuable. It was used in clothing, altar cloths, purses, and belts, and was highly valued. And so popular to the extent that later on, a few centuries later, you find workshops in Europe imitating the English embroidery. So that meant that England didn't have an exclusivity on it anymore. But this period, this particular century and the next, were the 2 centuries that this embroidery, which had been around for quite a long time, it had been around. St. Cuthbert's stole is done with opus work and with sort of English silver and gold threads. So that's why I chose Rosamond, for 2 reasons: that I could give that wider feel to the period, and because I wanted to simplify, I wanted to use her to have her story intersecting with that of Eleanor's. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. It works quite perfectly. Yeah. I mean, it's a really lovely little vignette into the life of somebody not from the top end of society, but sort of, you know, getting towards this end of society. And I think it's really lovely. And somebody who I think is a lovely character as well.
She is a lovely character. I really loved her, and I would have loved to have continued her into the 2nd book, which is now written and now with the publisher.
Brilliant.
The Damask Rose, which is about Eleanor's daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Castile.
Ooh.
Because I finished this book before the English Civil War, I used the English Civil War to open up the Damask Rose. Because Eleanor of Castile, and I need to explain this, why it finishes at that point, because things did disintegrate between Henry and the barons, who were then led by Simon de Montfort, because every time they tried to reinforce the Magna Carta and develop that, and Henry, they would withhold money from Henry, his treasury, unless he agreed articles that they drew up, and he agreed them, and he broke promises over and over again, and he would put out taxes that he shouldn't have put out, really, as they considered it, and so on. So within, I suppose, about 10 years of the Gascon problems, they're definitely at civil war in England. But the other thing that Henry did do was he brought his nephews and nieces back from Poitou and from the Lucinian territory, and gave them, so you end up having king's men and queen's men, and you have them being given the same kinds of things that the Savoyards 10 years previously had been given, the same sort of advantages, like marrying heiresses and so on and so forth, taking English heiresses away from English barons.
One of
and
which
heirs,
was
well.
One of which was the Earl of Pembroke, the Marshall title, the one that was held by the Marshalls, and it was given to de Valence.
Yes, William de Valence. He got that. He married. He married William Marshall's daughter, one of William Marshall's daughters, and Joan, her name was, and he was always trying to get the title of Earl of Pembroke. But the barons weren't having that, so he was really at odds. But William's a lovely character, actually. William also was a great one for fighting, for being in tournaments. So he was a great tournament player. He made his money doing that, actually. And every time he was going to go anywhere near a tournament, they tried to close down the tournament. So actually, Henry didn't really like tournaments. He would close them down himself. But he's got a great story. The Valence story is very, very, very interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. And actually he was the chief one that the barons at that point objected to, and at the beginning of the Civil War he was exiled, because what they would do is they'd say, Henry, we'll give you the money, but we'll release money to your treasury and we won't give you hassle, but you've got to exile so and so and so and so and so and so. So the people, they were actually reasonably pro the Savoyards at that point, because the Savoyards had been there for so long, but they were mostly, the ones that remaining were mostly churchmen.
Okay.
But they were, like, for example, one of Eleanor's brothers was Archbishop of Canterbury. But the thing is that William Valence, who was also a very good fighter and leader, was actually exiled for a time during the Civil War, then sneaked back. And it was him who actually, along with Gilbert de Clare, who was Simon's great pal at one point, but moved over to the other side. He kept changing sides, actually, Gilbert de Clare. But between William and Gilbert de Clare, they did manage to raise an army. There's a great story about how Prince Edward, who's grown up by this point, escaped from captivity with Simon de Montfort's captivity in Wales. He escaped, daring escape, wonderful story. Meanwhile, his wife Eleanor of Castile was over in Windsor Castle looking after that, and had as one of her prisoners one of Simon de Montfort's sons. So William de Valence features very strongly in the whole story of the escape and the defeat at Evesham of Simon de Montfort, which is where his life ended.
Exactly. It's such a huge story. I cannot wait to read the Damask Rose as well.
So the first part of the Damask Rose is all about that part of the story.
Oh, the Evesham
The Evesham, I've got Evesham in it. And I actually use not the embroiderer this time, but because Eleanor was very interested in gardens, and brought a lot of plants and gardens from Spain.
Oh,
I actually have a gardener, a female gardener in that story. Both those characters are made up, but when you come to the third story, which is the one I'm writing at the moment, about Isabella of France married to Edward II, who would have been Eleanor of Provence's grandson, she actually had a stonemason who was female design her tomb.
and
that would have been, yes, that's
real.
fact.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
That's real. And that was during the Black Death.
Cripes.
Just at the end of the Black Death. So how I'm doing that story is I'm starting off with the Black Death. I'm starting off at the end and with her summons to Castle Riesling in Norfolk. In Norfolk to actually take on this commission. So just like I did with the Woman in the Shadows, I'll come back to her journey, her 5-day journey up to Castle Rising, and then go back into the highlights of Isabella's story. But she is a real character.
Isn't she? That would be a good story
and
as
well. And the gardener is not a real character, but I use her in the same way as I use Rosalind. So those are the 3 stories.
So Eleanor of Castile, she was actually someone who was very into gardening and horticulture. That is real. Wow.
That is absolutely true. Everything I've used as a background is real. Like, for example, go back to the Silken Rose and Rosalind. Rosalind is an embroideress, and she ends up embroidering for the Queen. And most of her embroidery is not church embroidery, secular embroidery. And I have the Queen allow her to set up a workshop at Westminster Abbey, where there were lots of craft workshops, artisan workshops. So everything I've said about the embroidery, I've said about Eleanor's interests, true. The background is true and highly researched. Storyline about where she discovers, I shouldn't say too much.
Carol, unfortunately, I think the line has just, I know we were having problems earlier, so I think the line has just gone a little bit skew with. So, well, hopefully I'll try and contact you. But thank you so much for coming and speaking to us about the Silken Rose and the follow-up Damask Rose. Such an interesting story. It really is a great story, and I hope everybody tunes into and finds it. I'm going to put the directions on how to buy the Silken Rose into the description, so please look down there, and if you're watching this on Facebook, take a look, and I'll post the all the ways to buy it there. So thank you very much to Carol McGrath, and this is Ruadh Butler, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Hello, you back?
You're back.